So, if you remember back in episode 2, at the very beginning of the Age of Discovery, Spain and Portugal basically got carte blanche from the Pope to conquer the non Christian world and divided it between themselves with the Treaty of Tordesillas. Spain, of course, got the majority of the Pacific and Americas, while Portugal got Asia, Africa, Australia, and the northeast corner of South America. Now, it should be stated that not much of the actual world was known to either at the time of the treaty. So imagine it was like a mystery box. We know Spain did its best conquering the New World, but Portugal restricted most of its colonial empire to small enclaves and trading posts scattered throughout Asia and Africa, probably for a number of reasons like the presence of large, powerful empires and tropical diseases. But Portugal did establish sizable colonies in what are now Mozambique and Angola. But the largest piece was ironically in South America, close to Spain's turf. There is some dispute about the first sighting of South America by the Portuguese, but Pedro Alvares Cabral definitively landed and claimed the South American bulge in 1500. At first, small Brazil wood harvesting operations popped up, because it makes great instruments and dye. But this new land of Brazil was only formally organized in 1534, becoming 15 captaincies stretching to the as of yet unsurveyed Tordesillas line. 13 captaincies failed early on, and Portuguese conquistadores, inspired by the conquests of the Spaniards in Peru and Mexico, found little gold and silver. 2 captaincies, however, were able to turn a profit. Pernambuco did so by growing sugarcane, and São Vicente by becoming slavers of the native peoples, selling them abroad, like to the sugar plantations and mills of Pernambuco. These failures, and also Frenchmen probing the Brazilian coast, prompted the unification of the captaincies into one governorate general of Brazil in 1549. This arrangement would be amended in the succeeding centuries, but by independence, the colony would be reunified into one Brazil. But we'll get there. And the Portuguese had to fend off attempts by the French to establish their own colonies in Brazil, and also by the Dutch in the north between 1630 and 1654, before Portugal finally reigned supreme in Brazil. Now, Brazilian history can be divided economically into periods called cycles, and the initial Brazilwood cycle transitioned into the sugar cycle as overharvesting thinned the Brazilwood trees of the Atlantic rainforest. Sugar became king in Brazil, and native labor was steadily replaced by black African labor, which plantation owners preferred due to diminishing native populations from disease, Africans' greater familiarity with agriculture and resistance to those same diseases, and apparently Africans, so far from home, were easier to control than red natives, who could simply flee inland amongst their own. This led to the lion's share of slaves from Africa being imported to Brazil. Of around 12 million Africans enslaved and transported to the Americas between the 15th and 19th centuries, over 5 million went to Brazil alone. And the bulk of these poor enslaved people worked harvesting and processing sugar, which is labor-intensive and dangerous, involving large machines and boiling vats. And naturally, this created that classic plantation society of the American South and portions of Spanish America, a small landed elite of white planters in charge of vast fazendas populated by their enslaved black laborers. And in the rough frontier of northeastern Brazil, where infrastructure and communication were poor, these planters tended to act like little lords of their largely self-sufficient communities. While sugar has never stopped being important to Brazil, the largest producer of sugarcane today, its dominance declined towards the end of the 17th century as the Dutch and other colonial powers began opening up the Caribbean as a source of sugar plantations, and this leads into the gold cycle and the opening of the interior. While wealth in the Northeast settled on a slave plantation economy of sugar and other goods, in the Southeast, the aspiration was adventure. Banderaches, were explorer soldiers of fortune from the lands around Sao Paulo, and they ventured into the forests of Brazil looking for gold and slaves. In this complex cultural interchange, whites and reds mixed both in blood and in culture, and began forming their own settlements. Along for the ride were escaped slaves, and this melting pot of the three component races of the colony created a distinct Brazilness. Large gold deposits were finally found in the late 17th century, concentrated in the future states of Minas Gerais. And like any gold rush, this stimulated further settlement in the interior. In addition, the expansion of Banderaches and Portuguese desire to get in on the Peruvian silver trade caused colonial authorities to push towards the La Plata Basin. The modern south of Brazil became colonized this way. But unlike the northern plantation communities, these new cities evolved around cattle ranching estates. So far from either Portuguese or Spanish authorities, the south became a dangerous frontier populated by gauchos of the Pampas grasslands. Finally, in 1750, with both kingdoms disputing the south, Spain and Portugal agreed to amend the Tordesillas border. Spain was assured the greater Platine Basin, while accepting Portuguese expansion into modern Mato Grosso, the south, and much of the Amazon basin. Though a border was decided upon, it was again poorly surveyed, and the boundary remained porous, with so few people living in the Amazon jungles and Cerrado savanna. Brazil's story changes during the Napoleonic Wars. Seriously, this guy's impact on history goes far beyond his ephemeral conquests in Europe. Napoleon and Spain invade Portugal in 1807, and the Portuguese royal court moves to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Brazil, therefore, goes from a colony to the seat of an empire. And in the confusion of Spain's own wars of independence of America, Brazil also nabbed the Cisplatina. Napoleon is finally defeated in 1815, but Prince Regent John, King John VI from 1816, liked Brazil and the people, and didn't want to return home. So, he opted to elevate Brazil to an equal component of a new united kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. However, a liberal revolution in 1820 meant a constitution, and King John had to return home. Additionally, the liberals demanded Brazil return to being a colony. However, many Brazilians liked the freedom and autonomy they had enjoyed, but the ruling parliament of Portugal, the Cortes, made their move and abolished the kingdom of Brazil. Dom Pedro, son and heir of the king and prince regent of Brazil, rallied his supporters in Brazil for independence. He was proclaimed Emperor of Brazil in 1822. But rather than the medieval conception of universal sovereign, here emperor was meant to convey a monarch of the people, in contrast to a divinely appointed king. The Brazilian War of Independence raged for about 3 years all across the country. Emperor Pedro had his own problems with liberals attempting to draft a constitution and forcibly devolved the Brazil Constituent Assembly, prompting the provinces of Pernambuco, Ceará, and Paraíba to secede in 1824 as the Confederation of the Equator. But this was soon put down. Finally, in 1825, Portugal recognized the independence of Brazil, ending 300 years of colonial rule. However, the next year, King John VI died, and his son, Emperor Pedro, became King of Portugal, the very country he just got independence from. He knew, however, he couldn't reunite the two, so he soon abdicated in favor of his young daughter, Maria II. Pedro continued to act as regent for Portugal from Brazil, but when his brother Miguel became the new regent, Miguel decided to get rid of the constitution and seize the throne from his niece. At the same time, the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata had been warring to take back the Cisplatina. We know Brazil could not achieve victory, and finally agreed to the independent Uruguay. A constitutional monarch since 1824, Pedro was running into problem after problem, what with the loss of Cisplatina, his brother's coup, and butting heads with liberals at the General Assembly, who felt the emperor needed a little more oversight in policy. And Emperor Pedro expressed sympathy for the abolition of slavery, which was inconceivable for many powerful landowners in the assembly. Finally, distracted and consumed by the events in Portugal, and probably exhausted with Brazilian politics, Pedro abdicated in 1831 and returned to Portugal, restoring his daughter to the throne. His young son Pedro became emperor as Pedro II. During his regency, Brazil experienced further secession crises. The Cabanagem in Grau-Pará, the Ragamuffin War in Rio Grande do Sul and Santa Catarina, Sabinada in Bahia, and Balaiada in Maranhão. It looked for a time that Brazil would follow Spanish America and break apart, but the Brazilian army managed to quell them all and preserve the country's unity. Emperor Pedro II actually proved to be quite capable, despite being so young, and maneuvered his country through a number of political crises. Like its contemporary, the U.S., Imperial Brazil had to grapple with increasing pressure, both international and within, from abolitionist liberals, to restrict and ultimately abolish slavery. However, the power of agricultural elites was even stronger in Brazil than in the antebellum American South. The Brazilian gold mines began to run dry towards the end of the 18th century, and Brazil shifted focus to agricultural exports, back to basics: sugar, cotton, and cattle. But with the Industrial Revolution in Europe and North America, workers getting up at the crack of dawn for their long shifts began to need something different: coffee. Coffee steadily became Brazil's next greatest export, beginning the coffee cycle, and its production was concentrated in São Paulo, again shifting the locus of power in the country. And this gave a small number of landowners a lot of wealth and power. Even so, despite the existence of slavery and a plantation oligarchy, Brazil experienced great economic growth during Pedro's reign, and modern technology like railroads, steamships, and telegraphs were being imported and spread across the country to link it together, like her bigger neighbor, the USA. And despite some falls of cabinets and the General Assembly's constant bickering and partisanship, Emperor Pedro made sure the political system progressed smoothly, by the book. This stable political climate and economic growth attracted immigrants from Europe, mainly Germans, Spanish, Portuguese, and especially Italians. And they preferred to settle in the south, creating small-town, European-style farming communities, in contrast to the lands of the coffee lords and sugar barons further north. Demographically, Brazil shifted from around 4 million people at independence, about a quarter white, half black, a fifth all kinds of mixed, and the remainder red, to in 1890 over 14 million, 44% white, 15% black, 30% mixed, and 9% red. And that population growth occurred largely in the south. After the failure of the Cisplatin War, Brazil followed it up with victory after victory in the Platine, Uruguayan, and Paraguayan wars, and signed treaties with their neighbors to establish borders and peaceful relations and trade. Brazil looked well on its way to becoming the next great American power, modern and prosperous. But as the emperor grew old and weary, his will to maintain the empire faltered. His son had predeceased him, and Pedro and much of the elite of the country felt the Princess Isabel, a woman, on the throne inappropriate, notwithstanding then Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Empress of India, reigning over the world's mightiest empire at the time. In either case, Pedro always butted heads with the conservative landowning elite, them finding his liberal inclinations disruptive. Fall of the empire is complicated, and is only understood with the addition of the military in its popularity and success after war victories, modernization, and a newer, positivist officer corps. A crucial blow to imperial legitimacy came from the 1888 passage of the Golden Law, signed by the Princess Isabel in her father's absence. It freed Brazil's slaves a full 23 years after the U.S., making Brazil the last one to the abolition party in the Americas. To the great plantation owners, the abolition of slavery demonstrated that the monarchy could no longer be relied upon to respect their interests, and they threw their lot in with the Republicans in the military. In 1889, in a bloodless coup that the aged and exhausted Emperor Pedro made no effort to stop, the monarchy was overthrown, replaced with the Republic of the United States of Brazil, known to posterity as the Old Republic. While a modern constitutional federal republic like the USA, the First Republic was in truth controlled by a clique of agricultural oligarchs, with all the familiar trappings of machine politics and patronage systems. Two states, Sao Paulo of the coffee and Minas Gerais of the dairy, came to dominate the new political landscape. Therefore, the arrangement became known as the coffee and milk era. Limited industrialization and urbanization had occurred under the empire, but the firm empowerment of the planter oligarchs oriented Brazil towards export cash crops, so much that domestic food production had to be supplemented with imports from the USA and elsewhere. Financially, Brazil was dependent on foreign loans for capital, and domestic industry languished. The wealthier nations of North America and Europe wanted Brazilian coffee, sugar, and cattle, and by the end of the century, the rubber being harvested in the Amazon during the rubber cycle. Economics is a messy science that's more art than science at times, but I believe this gravely altered Brazil's previous trajectory. Agricultural elites can make do with poor, illiterate tenant farmers, especially in Brazil, where farming equipment was little more sophisticated than horse plows and hoes, and land was cleared by burning down forest. Rural communities were still isolated, and literacy low. The new elites, in contrast, who rose in Europe and North America, were of the industrialist and financier variety. And while factory owners love cheap immigrant labor, they also have a great need for educated professionals, engineers, lawyers, scientists, accountants, clerks. That's not to say a middle class didn't exist in Republican Brazil, but it grew slowly. World War I disrupted the expected imports from Europe, and so domestic industry grew, and by 1930, the middle urban classes had achieved a critical mass, demanding political reform and representation. A contested election and an assassination led to revolution, and Getulio Vargas took power as virtual dictator. The story of Brazil continues on, of course, but ultimately the optimistic forecasts of it breaking into the ranks of great power have fallen short. Due to a plethora of social, political, economic, historical, and even geographical factors, for the time being at least, Brazil is stuck as the perpetual superpower of the future, instead of the present. Because it enjoyed a period of relative stability and prosperity, the easily romanticized empire is fondly remembered by many as a golden age, especially as a corrupt oligarchic republic and coups and juntas and dictatorships followed. But despite all these pitfalls and the problems Brazil continues to experience, I think the main takeaway is, unlike her neighbors, Brazil managed to keep together and build a flawed, but beautiful, rich, and unique nation. So there we have it. The three main Americas, Anglo, Hispano, and Lusitano. These three great spheres share this enormous, glorious, diverse, one America. And I wouldn't have it any other way. From the high Arctic islands to the Tierra del Fuego, the rich histories of every bit in between have left an indelible mark on the land and its people, for better or worse. After all, though it's not all pretty, nothing is perfect. But that's what makes the world and life so fascinating and worth exploring, those imperfections. For as the old Professor Tolkien said, no matter what evil can contrive, in the end, it merely enriches the tapestry of the grand design. Next time, I have something very special I want to share. Until then, thank you for watching.